Um, yeah, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for coming for the late session. I'm Daniel Block. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Cesso. We're a startup focused on blockchain-based land registries and transactions. If there's any questions, just like during the presentation, I guess just let me know. We can go through it at that time or afterwards. Okay, so I guess a bit about me. I'm from the U.S. I've been working on blockchain projects for the past 6 years, originally around Bitcoin. I go into more of an explanation of what blockchain is in a bit. For the last 2 years, we've been building solutions in Accra, in Ghana, with the Ghana Lands Commission and a few banks. And right now, we've recently rebranded, so the company is called Cesso, and we're looking to, as we say, formalize land registries through private sector transactions. So I say one of the first things you'll see when you get to Ghana are signs such as this, this property not for sale. And even this one is protected from the grave. So this is very common. You see throughout Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya. Oftentimes this is the last resort for people to protect their land rights. And so when someone's taking a transaction or trying to buy a house, you come and to this property, and you'll see H.O. Cordy is going to come at you from the grave. So the last ability to protect the land. A lot of people think this is the reason why most of these land registries are held in paper. Due to paper registry, it's easy to fraud. It's easy as all you need is Photoshop and a printer, and you can easily say, oh, I own this house. Or you can take one title, split it into three, and sell the property 3 times. One thing we look at is, I'm sure you're aware of that there's billions of dollars spent each year through the World Bank, through overseas development agencies, DFID, USAID, a lot of projects around digitizing the land registries, around surveying and mapping, around collecting data and such. And it's interesting to see, in Ghana we found that over the past 15 years, $250 million has been invested into digitizing the land registry. Unfortunately, 0% is digitized. It looks about the same. And so the thought is that there's all this money going towards this problem. I think that anyone can understand that a digital land registry is a benefit. It's a benefit for the government. It's a benefit for citizens who can pass down generational wealth. It's a benefit to construction companies, to banks. So there's a lot of effort that are out there to survey, to digitize, but we've seen very, very little progress. And so I would say here, I think part of it is just kind of understanding what the problem is. And I think people who come in to digitize the registries to solve these problems really only see the really top layer of the issue and such. And we say that on 2 factors. One, you come to digitize a registry in Ghana, say, or in Kenya, Nigeria. One issue is that in most of these countries, the land titles are not registered. A lot of land does not have title. So if you want to, say, digitize the land registry, what are you actually digitizing if there hasn't been title registration? Secondly, look at Ghana as a use case. Ghana has 80% customary land. So in that case, you come to digitize the government registry, but the government is only in control or does administration on 20% of the land. So even with a fully digitized registry, you're not really solving the core of the problem. So that's why I always say that there's 2 main issues around the trust in the land registry. Firstly, around ownership, who owns the land, who has the ability to transact on the land, but also trust on the transaction. Can the transaction take place? If I buy a property, do I actually own the property? If I'm a bank and I give a mortgage, can I foreclose on the property? And one thing, kind of from my experience, always reference back to Ghana and saying that if you look at Kumasi, Ghana's second biggest city, this land is owned by the Ashanti king. It's no question to anybody on who owns the land. It's obvious who owns the land. But still, there's an inability to transact because even though maybe the trust and the ownership is there, the trust in the transaction is not there. So as I say that there's a few different levels of trust that need to come into a land registry. There's the trust within the government. Does the government registry actually show who really owns the land? And if I query the government registry, does it have a basis? Can I trust that query? Can I trust what the government tells me when they register the land? Or am I going to be doing all this effort through the government only to find out that somebody else claims the land and they don't really back up my claim at all? I think there needs to be trust within the customary land, especially in areas where huge amounts of the countries are not governed by the government, but with customary land. Can we trust the transactions in the customary land? Can we trust that mortgages can be foreclosed on? Can we trust that renters will pay their rent? So just beyond whether or not the government registry is digitized, there's a lot of layers of trust that need to go into securing land transactions. So I say that blockchain is the technology that can provide this trust. On the simplistic aspect, the blockchain is a permission database. It's a ledger book. We say the next level after cloud computing, we come to blockchain. So blockchain allows you to store data. There's 3 pillars around the blockchain. Firstly, that's a bit off, but immutability. Any action on the blockchain is immutable. Any transaction on the database can never be changed. So if I send a land title from A to B, there's no way that it can be changed. I cannot send it to B and then also send it to C. Any transaction on the blockchain database is immutable. Secondly, is transparent. Anyone can query a blockchain database. Again, going back to the core, it's a permission database. Whoever sets up the database, whoever sets up the blockchain decides who it's transparent for. So if we want to have, say, a government registry, it should be free to query by anybody. But if the government wants to say it's only queried by the corporate sector, we can set in those permissions and allow it to be transparent only to those within the database. Secondly, the blockchain provides security. The way data is secured on the blockchain, again, allows it to be immutable. It can't be changed. It allows for smart contracts, which allows contracts to be executed automatically through the blockchain. So when the person A signs for the document, immediately funds are released. When these 3 people sign, immediately the title is transferred. So there's a lot of security in the blockchain database to ensure that the asset is transferred properly, the database is being updated properly, and the payments done through these smart contracts are done efficiently. So I want to just talk about a few case studies around land transactions that have been done on the blockchain over the past few years. I think that most people know blockchain from Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a digital currency that you can send anywhere in the world. It's borderless, a currency that can be traded in the trusted blockchain network, no middlemen, peer-to-peer lending or peer-to-peer money transactions. So just like blockchain is being stored and then distributed through the blockchain, the same can be done with other assets. Just like a Bitcoin can be sent throughout the world, why can't a land title be digitized, secured, and also sent throughout the world? Why can't this land title be put on the blockchain, divisible into 1 million different parts, and then be transferred in 1 million ways throughout the world? And there's no reason that shouldn't be done. So currently, there's been a few case studies around blockchain in land registries. Georgia, Sweden, and then the work we had done in Ghana. So maybe just to get some practical kind of understanding, I can go through these case studies. So in Sweden, a company called ChromaWay has been working to digitize land title registration on the blockchain. So how does this work? The different people within the land title registration process, if there's a mortgage, for instance, the bank, the title registrar, the property owner, are all given access to a digital interface, which ChromaWay runs, to facilitate actions done on the blockchain. So again, the person who sets up the blockchain sets up the rules and sets up the permissions for this database. So what happens in the land registration process in Sweden is that this is done fully automated. So each party has a role to play, and what it adds is one, speed. Everyone works in this digital workstation to complete the land title registration. Two is an audit trail. So any transaction done on the blockchain is timestamped and recorded. So that way, when we want to understand how was this land title registered, who at the government signed off on it, when did the property owner sign, and when did he pay, everything is recorded on the blockchain. So if there is an issue with the land title, not only can you go and look at the land title and understand when it was created, we can break down the entire land registration process and understand at every point who did what, where were their payments done, who were they done between, and can we summons in, if needed, the people within those transactions. And the last aspect, they do this to provide security, to ensure that every time a land title is registered, that it's only going to happen once. They can't register another land title, that it's a unique object that is created. Okay. Second kind of case study is in a different aspect around land registration. Was done in Georgia. It was led by a company called Britt Fury and Hernando de Sotos. Hernando de Sotos wrote The Mystery of Capital, big thinker in the land title registration space. And what they did in Georgia was very interesting, was that the Georgian government already had an existing digital land registry. So what they did was they took this digital land registry. It should be almost you think of, say, South Africa, that already has a Windeed, a Corbitech type system. So they took an existing registry, they put that onto the blockchain. And why is that important? The blockchain doesn't verify data, so you need to make sure that what is put onto the blockchain is accurate. Because if there's an interesting project that was done in Costa Rica a few years ago, where they digitized the whole land registry in Costa Rica. And when they did an audit afterwards, they found that the ministers own the entire coastline on both coasts. So, just because, the data, the technology is secure, it's still humans who are setting up the technology. So need to ensure that, the setup is done properly. So in Georgia, what they did was they took the existing land registry. They had people checking to make sure the government didn't own the prime areas after the transition. And then they put the registry, each land title became a digital asset, similar to a Bitcoin, that was stored on the blockchain. So now forever on, in Georgia, when a land transaction is done, it's done through the blockchain. All transactions are secured, all transactions are time-stamped and audited, and there becomes a history of all the transactions. If you took a land title and, again, divided it by 10,000 and sold off shares into the property, all of those would be transacted on the blockchain. We could follow the sale of these assets, forever, and always find how it got back to that. So the work we've been doing in Ghana is a bit different. As I was saying before, that in Ghana it comes to a bit of a different issue than, say, Georgia. There's not an existing land registry to follow. So to come to the government and say, we want to digitize your land registry, they're using maps from still like colonial times that like stretch across this room. So it's not really a practical solution. So what we say is we're not trying to protect at first the ownership, we want to protect the transaction. And so what we've been doing is working with a few of the banks in Ghana to create the mortgage and construction process on the blockchain. So what that does is we take a contract say a sale contract, the mortgage contract, the rental contract, we can digitize the entire contract aspect. So the signatures are built in. The signatures unlock other aspects. The payment sits in escrow, for instance, until all the needed signatures are signed. And what we want to do there is create a process flow, timestamp and record every part of the mortgage transaction, every part of the sale on the blockchain, so we can understand who at the bank created this loan, who at the government verified the search, who at the government registered the title. If there's an insurance agent, how did they play into it? When did they transact? So if there becomes an issue with the land transaction, we can always go back to the blockchain and see every single transaction. We can understand who did what action in this land in this land transaction. When can we summons them in and ask why? Is there a reason to distrust that they did not do this action? The answer would be no, because it's recorded onto the blockchain. Your question? Yeah, definitely. Great question. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that people always kind of wonder that and just be like, where do I log into the blockchain, and start using it in that end. But it's the same concept. I always like tie it back to the internet. That nobody says like, oh, I'm using the internet. They say I'm using Google. I'm using a LinkedIn. That's using the internet. Does anybody know really how the internet works here? Like, I barely do. And but everyone trusts that it works, and we trust the interfaces behind it and such. And so I don't think like right now there's a lot of buzz around blockchain and like blockchain. It's gonna change the world. But if we see that changing the world, it's not gonna be saying like Bitcoin changed the world. It's gonna be some company name like Google that uses the blockchain that changes the world. I always say to the Ghana Lands Commission, we always say like, all right, we got this amazing solution. It's going to make tons of money for the government. We're going to transact the land titles, get stamp duty and such. And do you want to know how it works? And they say, absolutely not. As long as it works, we're okay with that. And so I think for a lot of people, it's hard to understand that concept. And I would say one example I always use is that I'm very confident that very soon we're going to see, as I was saying on the panel earlier, we're going to see central bank-backed cryptocurrencies. So we're going to see a BitRand. They won't adopt Bitcoin, but they'll adopt their own digital currency and such. And how best, if I were to market that to an average person, am I really going to go to them and explain to them how blockchain works, all your transactions are recorded, this and that? No, the interface will look like mobile money. I would say this is mobile money. It's a government-led system rather than a telecom-based system. What's the difference? It's the exact same, because to them it is the exact same, But the real benefits are for KYC, for understanding the transaction, for selling debt and allowing more to tokenize and then say sell assets much more easy. So I don't think there's ever going to be a time. I think when you see Bitcoin successful, it's going to be the time where no one knows what Bitcoin is. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, in two regards. So on data storage, blockchain data is stored very similar to how cloud storage is. There's two different types of blockchains. There's a public blockchain that anyone can query, transparent to the entire world. And then there's the concept of private blockchains that are only transparent and visible to select people within that you want to be able to query your database. So in a public blockchain, there's nodes set up. So these are data storages that anyone can set up a node. Anyone wants to run a node, they can help the network. They could set one up today. And you actually store part of the blockchain. And you store the transactions that are done on it. They recently launched nodes into space. So now there's satellites that are holding Bitcoin and blockchain transactions. So they say if there's a nuclear war, if Trump pulls the trigger on North Korea, Bitcoin will still be running. Um, and so we have that aspect, and then in your question on the authenticity and aspect, again, that's a huge issue. And again, going back to the problem with land titles on the blockchain, it's a very simplistic approach to say we're going to take all the land titles and put them on the blockchain, and that solves all the problems. Again, how do we know are these the correct land titles? There's generally when you go from a paper to a digital system, there's a huge opportunity for corruption because all you need to do is register your interest and you are now into the new database. You are now the law, in that regard. So that has its own separate issues. And that's why, before anything goes onto the blockchain, becomes digital, we need, people collecting data sets. We need people in the land title aspect. We need people going door to door, doing community sessions. When you saw after the Rwandan Civil War, there was a project to digitize the land registry in Rwanda. It wasn't on the blockchain, but they're looking at now going the Dubai route or the Georgia route, existing digital to blockchain. But what they did in Rwanda, they took teams into every single village in Rwanda. They sat down with the villagers. They had maps of the village. They asked people to identify which ones were their properties. They asked people to verify their neighbors' properties. And through a massive village-by-village effort to understand the land records, to understand the registry, the current registry of Rwanda was built. That's not easy. But again, what I feel is that the benefits are too great not to do that. And so whether it's government-led, whether it's private sector-led, in order to make these land titles public, to make a marketplace for lending, for construction, there will need to be a big authenticity initiatives done in order to get us to the point where we can say we can access this technology. So that's a great thing about the blockchain. Whoever sets up the blockchain sets that up. So that's another interesting thing. So we can set up 3-party verifications, username, password. We can do username, password, phone verification. We can do username, password, phone verification, and thumbprint ID. And so that person who's setting up the blockchain sets the rules of how people identify themselves within the blockchain. And so if you want low verification, it's not a problem. You can do that, and you can make things work faster, but have less, security. If you want to have 5 factors of authentication, it could be easier. It could be more difficult to use, but you're more secure. But that's what's exciting, I think, about the blockchain is that we say it's a permission database. And so the interesting thing is that the permission within the database can be given and taken very liquid. I can assign you a priority and then take part of it away. I can add you more authority. I can change your signature that needs a multi-signature with somebody else. And then when it comes into the corporate space, I think that's one big benefit of blockchain is who is blockchain databases, who is it competing with? Well, it's competing with Oracle solutions, with SAP solutions. And if I'm a Barclays and I'm running a SAP solution and I need a small change, I need to bring in a team of engineers to make the change for me. When we have programmable databases, programmable contracts, these slight changes can be done very quickly. I can add a second layer of authentication. I can add a third layer. I can add multi-signatures. So I think it also gives a lot of power to the organizations who are holding the contracts, who are creating their blockchain solutions. Yeah.
Sorry, Daniel, you've addressed the question of security fairly extensively, but there's one aspect that's a bit bothering me. Is if you go to the rural areas, from time to time you have portions of land that are in dispute. Okay, so more than one person would identify with the land to say, it's my land. How would your system recognize that portion? Would you isolate it in the meantime, or how would you identify? Or would you allow both parties to stake their claim?
Yeah, no, exactly what you said. We'd want to identify the land dispute and such. This kind of comes into the previous question, saying that how do we authenticate and such that, I don't think the blockchain doesn't, correct, it doesn't verify data. It just holds data and stores it. So we do need a process to verify the data. My thought has been, when we're working in Ghana and such, that we had the same issue, and a lot of land is disputed and such, but we'd say a lot of land is not disputed. So more what we'd like to do is say whoever's transacting on the land, if you're buying a land, if you're mortgaging a land, have a visual to understand what land is being disputed and avoid that land. I think what's even worse about disputed lands is that oftentimes after a land is disputed by two people, it then gets sold again and gets sold again. So you have now 5 people disputing the same land. So without identifying where the problems are, you're only going to get more issues, more disputes. And my thought had always been that, like, if we look at all the land that's available for sales, for mortgages and such, there's a lot of available land. Maybe for right now, we're going to have to avoid land that's disputed. Once all the land is taken up and the only land available is disputed land, there's now a big financial interest to solve that dispute. So what's the issue? How can we solve that? Does it mean settling one of the parties because now this land has become very valuable? Does it come to going to court? So my thought has always been that that land should just be identified and understood where land is disputed. And let's for now avoid those plots of land, avoid third, fourth party, disputes. And then when there's a financial interest to solve the dispute, I think that would be the time. Yeah.
How do you get around the potential of a hacker getting in there to purge the data? And we're kind of expanding on the same theme here of security. Just actually purging it, not loading false information, but removing the data. Is that potentially possible?
Yeah, definitely. So you can't, like, a key aspect, blockchain actually is a very old concept. A lot of it was developed in the 70s. And what we see, it's really the first kind of use case of what was really cryptographic research for like the past 30, 40 years. So the way the data is stored, look it up more, but a cryptographic hash tree. It's a concept of how data is stored, meaning that you can't pull the data out and make it and remove it permanently. That data will always be stored because every set of data is attached to the entry before and after. That's what they call it, a blockchain. It's a chain of data. So it's impossible to actually remove something. And in your aspect of saying the land data, most people would argue that it's best for land data to be public. In America, it's in our Constitution. Land data is public. You can query any land data and such. And then, in that end, so I would argue that land data should be public and should be able to be pooled and should be analyzed and such. A lot of governments do not want that. It's a question of security. If I know where somebody lives, I can go and do negative deeds to them. But for us, we feel that I'll go back to one slide. That people want to make their land data public. You know what I mean? In Ghana, in Nigeria, people are trying so hard, they're writing it on the side of their wall and such. So, my thought on that would more be to encourage the people to make their data public. Is it stolen? Could it be done in that end? It's very difficult, to alter the data. Could it be taken and used for other purposes? Potentially. But that's going to be more around like how well the security of the database is used and what does the government want to make public and what do they want to keep private.
Yeah, hi. So I understood you take lots of actions in order to input whatever data you input into the system is correct. But what happens once the data is there and then say it was verified, it's totally secured and stored, and then the property is under dispute or under arrest? In some countries it can take years for it to be visible. How do you, then basically it means that potentially the data that the system holds becomes not really correct. How do you face that?
Yeah, definitely. So in concepts such as Bitcoin and such, the data can never be changed. So that would be an issue that you have the land title system. It can't be changed. It's immutable in that end. But generally what we see in, say, government-led systems is kind of a quasi like public, private system. so that the data is immutable, meaning that an individual person cannot change the data, but you would have a system administrator who could update it if necessary and such. So one thing I would say in that end is that I think what would just be important is that if all of the parties within the system are plugged into this blockchain and are plugged into this database, so that active court cases become part of the registry. You can see where there are court cases. People can publicly make disputes on the platform and can show that there. I think the best solution is that if we can really increase the volume of data, we can make more decisions and such. And maybe that property that has a public dispute on it doesn't actually have a dispute. Someone is just putting false data onto the blockchain. But again, I think it's best to have all that data public, let that be known, and then let people transact, based on whether they find it, trustworthy or not. I think we can't decide whether somebody wants to buy a land that's disputed. That's their decision. If they feel that they trust the person, you can't say, well, the blockchain says, it shouldn't be transacted on. That wouldn't really be the case. But we find that the best way is to make as much data public, let as much be understood, let every part of the transaction be timestamped and recorded, so at least we have a full understanding of the data that's available beforehand. And then again, if there is an issue that something needs to be changed, you have system administrators still, so you can still go back and hard code in a change into the blockchain database. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to try and understand. So, what is the benefit of if you already got a digitized system? So, if it's already digitized, what is the difference? What is the benefit of having it on blockchain because it's already there? So, if it's already all public, let's say, for example, Windeed and the South African Land Registry, it's all public. So, what is the benefit of going onto blockchain? That's the first question. Second question is, you said about private blockchains. So if it's private blockchains, does that get housed in, call it a company's own server with their own computers, or is the private blockchain still on a million computers?
Yeah. Okay. So on the first question, what is the advantage of say Windeed going onto the blockchain? In reality, that is not the best use case. It's much better for a country that's, say, paper going to digital to go onto the blockchain. There would be small benefits in the sense that, one, you're not trusting Windeed that Corby Tech is keeping it accurate. That we do trust them, and we trust that they are being right and being, just players in the market. But the blockchain would ensure that. So making sure that every change is timestamped, every change is on the audit trail. Secondly, I would say would be tokenization. So that's kind of a concept I mentioned earlier, like ICOs, where you can take an asset, say a property, you can tokenize it. You can then start transacting on the tokens. The concept, if you want to look into it more in depth, is called ICOs, initial coin offerings, and they've raised through ICOs, $2 billion have been raised in the last 6 months. So I think there's a lot of things that you can do after the digitization. That's why I was saying in the Georgia project, the initial benefit is very small, from going from a digital system to a blockchain digital system. But what they're more hoping is that the next steps will be much greater, where we can now tokenize the titles. We can allow smart contracts on the title and such. But again, saying like a mobile money system compared to a blockchain-led government bank currency or central bank-led currency, for the individual user, the benefit will be very minimal. I think that it'll look almost the same to them. But at the end of the day, the databasing, the KYC, the understanding, the auditing of the database becomes much more simple. What was the second question?
Second question was about the private blockchain.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's up to the creator of the blockchain. The Luxembourg government recently created a blockchain and has nodes set throughout the country and such. You would still want more than one data center, mainly because if your data center goes down, then you lose all the data. So say South Africa, the South African Central Bank recently did a BitRand. It was a RAND currency on the blockchain. They wouldn't want to risk having one data center holding the central bank, the currency of the country and such. So what they would do is, they would have data centers, in Cape Town, in Pretoria, in Joburg, and throughout the country and such, and maybe some outside the country in case there was an issue. And some in space as well, of course. You gotta have the nuclear. Cool.
Sorry, can I ask another question?
Yeah, for sure.
Can you explain more about tokens and so what is the next usages of it? So, so you said that once the land registries are on the blockchain, so what do tokens actually do?
Definitely. Make any asset easily divisible. So any asset, say on the blockchain, people are looking at building asset markets on the blockchain, stock exchanges on the blockchain, mercantile exchanges on the blockchain and such. So one, to make the asset much more divisible. So I can rather than putting into 1 cent, I can make it 1/1,000,000th of a cent per token. So I can make it much more divisible, any asset on the blockchain. And secondly, just decrease the amount of the cost of capital. So right now it is expensive to invest. It's expensive to invest in a stock exchange. It's expensive to invest in a property and such. But if you can go, say, on an app on your phone and buy 1/1,000th of a property in South Africa, that does open up a lot of, of course there are some legal aspects that would have to be worked out and such, but that does create like a market outside of the country. You put that onto a cryptocurrency exchange and such, you're now creating billions of dollars of capital, for a market that people are halfway across the world investing in. And so that's why I think that blockchain, especially the concept of ICO, should definitely be considered as a alternative funding method, especially here on the continent where the cost of capital is very high and the availability of capital is very low.
Just a quick one. I can see you getting a bit tired there.
Oh, good.
So for me, as let's say the person on the other end buying the token after your ICO, how do I get a return in investment? How do I realize that? So, like you said, I could buy a stock in like a market that's outside my country. So let's say I buy a stock in America, but what matters to me is the monetary value of that and how I can liquefy that. So how easy is it to liquefy that Bitcoin? I mean the token. And let's take the example you just made with breaking up a property into a million, like smaller units.
Yeah.
What's the point? Where's the value in that? I can't. Or is the value in me selling that millionth of the property to someone else, or is that property making a return for me? So can you just clarify that one, please? Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So on the liquidity aspect, in general, what you're doing is you're buying a token that has a purpose and such. Bitcoin's value is partly determined by the transaction volume. So you're investing with the thought that the transaction volume is going to increase, thus price is going to increase to grow the market cap of the system and such. So that's why in the tokenized version, you're investing in the token to believe that there's going to be more transactions in the token, thus the value of the token will be increasing. So one in the property space that might be interested to look into is called Proppy. Proppy is based in Ukraine. They're working with the Ukrainian government, kind of around this aspect, a token for property in the Ukraine. There is a big issue in liquidity and such that a lot of these systems, they raise $100 million in tokens, and like, hell yeah, $100 million, and then you're like, well, who's going to take my token? So there is an issue, like mainly in liquidity in that regards, And of course, if you own a lot of tokens, as in any currency, you don't want to crash the system. So it's not in your best interest to sell off, and do a dump on the token and such. So there has to be long-term trust in these tokens. And I think, again, $2 billion in the last 6 months showing that there is a lot of global trust in these tokens and such. So one thing I would say is not an issue, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to set up exchanges. It's an opportunity to make these currencies more liquid and more easily tradable. And there are a few cryptocurrency exchanges in South Africa. I think you're going to see more starting. I think you're going to see more starting throughout the continent, throughout the world. So I think that's just an issue of this is an early market, and we're going to see the infrastructure be built around it. Then the aspect of why I want to tokenize and who's benefiting out of the system, it would be for investment, in the concept of that. I have a lot of issue gathering bank financing for my property, or I can't. It's hard to get a renter or anyone to buy half of the property and such. So the thought would be that a lot of the tokenization is to gain capital from a market that doesn't currently yet exist. That they say that 80%, I was reading something that like 80% of cryptocurrency investments come from China. So say we were going to take property development, we were going to take Santon, say it wasn't mortgaged, it was just built already, and we'd take all the land titles and make them divisible with tokens and such. We could then open an exchange for people to buy, partial ownership of buildings, buy partial ownership of businesses. And this kind of goes into the bigger kind of concept worldwide of crowdfunding, raising money from the crowd, raising $1 from 1 million people rather than $1 million from one person. So I think in the tokenization aspect, it's really a new kind of concept to raise global financing through the concept of crowdfunding. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.